Okay, hi everyone. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I am, Grace, your host, but I have lots of fun people here with me today. This is my first time doing like a somewhat live, I guess it's not actually live, but like a live stream on my channel, so very exciting. And we are going to be talking about the Age of Madness trilogy by Joe Abercrombie, which is, I think it's safe to say, a favorite for all of us. So there will be a lot of gushing going on, I'm sure. But I believe we're all on the same page about this being a spoiler discussion. So if you haven't read these books, this is your cue to not spoil yourself. And hopefully, if you do read them, you'll come back later and watch us talk about them. But just to start us off, I thought I might start with the toughest question of all. I was going to ask everybody to introduce themselves and maybe try and pick your favorite book from the trilogy. So, I mean, Ben and Pete, you guys are to my top side.
Yep.
So do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I asked you this before we started. To introduce myself, I'm Ben. You know me because I'm with her in a relationship. So I'm sure my name's popped up, and this is my housemate, who is a man that does not read. And has been on a journey of listening to audiobooks, kind of actually reading for the first time. And Abercrombie is your first big series.
I think at this point, Abercrombie probably accounts for between 15 and 20% of all the books I've ever read.
Yeah,
which I think makes me more of an expert than anyone else.
Absolutely. And to answer the question, my favorite is The Trouble with Peace. I can't speak for you, but I think The Trouble with Peace. I loved the class rage in A Little Hatred, and I really loved the ending of Wisdom of Crowds. But I think just as a whole, The Trouble with Peace kind of did everything perfectly, rather than I think the other books are stronger in some ways, but weaker in others. Whereas the Trouble with Peace is just a banger, just a straight up banger.
Yeah, I think for me, well, you asked me what my favorite one was before we started recording, and I just sort of completely turned to static because as soon as I started thinking about it, I was like, maybe it is Trouble with Peace, but I can remember very little about the Trouble with Peace, and I think that's entirely down to the sort of consistency. I think I remember a lot of bits from the other books because there were sections of it that I didn't like as much, or I felt sort of dragged on. It's like, oh, I remember that in isolation of the rest of the book. Whereas I think I remember so little about Trouble with Peace because I just consistently enjoyed all of it and nothing stood out as sort of being a cut above anything else.
It's a good answer.
But it's all good.
I guess Merphy, if we're going to continue going around.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Trouble with Peace. I'm Merphy. And, I read the books like 2 years ago, I think, so I'm going to be the weakest link in this discussion because it's all fuzzy. But Trouble with Peace was one of the best books I read all year that year.
Bryce, self-centered. Yeah, I mean, what's funny is usually I'm like the opposite of Ben in favorite, and by opposite I mean if you're tier listing, all of these are S tier, but here's the the top of the S tier. But I'm with you right now. Everyone. Trouble with Peace. I think it's Leo Dan Brock's arc was just so insane for me. There was that one. There's just a bunch of things. I don't know, but I like the argument of consistency. I think I'm still shocked by the Wisdom of Crowds and sheer just so I think I almost need a reread to be it might be my favorite, but I was so shocked by it and just some of the the constant death, I guess, and throwing people off of a tower. I don't know. That stuff was just because we're spoiler, right? So I didn't.
Oh yeah.
Okay. I hope so.
That was just so shocking.
With everyone saying that the third book is their favorite.
Yeah. Yeah, Trouble with Peace. I have a lot of trouble with peace apparently.
I'm also a Trouble with Peace stan. So I think that honestly, the books feel kind of fuzzy to me as well, not in the events of them, but in the distinction between them.
Mhm.
Just because, like, now that it's been, I don't know, what has it been, like 3 months or something? I look back and I'm like, well, if I concentrate really hard, I can pick out the divisions. But if I don't, I'm kind of like, all this stuff just happened. And all this
Yeah.
happened in one story that happened to be split into 3 books.
Well, and I wonder if it's because that's how he wrote it, right? He was like, I'm going to take a break. I'm not just going to publish these one. I'm going to write the whole thing. Then we're going to publish once we're ready, once it's all been written.
Yeah.
And so that's just fundamentally kind of how it was written. So yeah, I'm with you too. It's hard to exactly pinpoint, but it is because it's all just one kind of consistent thing.
It's got it with the parts as well. Like, it's all continuous. Like, there's no it's not like you go back to part 1 like you do in like First Law. This one's just straight on to the next, straight on to the next. And it's kind of like, I wonder whether he like, because Mistborn was written that way as well. Part of me is like, did he Mistborn it? Like, is it that kind of like on Lord of the Rings where it's like, I'm just gonna write it all at once, and then
Like Mistborn Era 1 was written that way?
yeah, and I think he's going back to writing it that way for 3, right? Is that they were all written and then were published or something. I'm pretty sure that's the case. I'm sure someone will tell me that I'm horrifically wrong and I should feel bad about it. But, you know, I'm saying it with my chest.
You should
We
feel
are on
bad
the
about
internet.
even saying it in the first place.
Absolutely. What I'm
I didn't
saying
know
is,
it was written that way, but that I feel like makes sense for that series too. They
Mhm.
have some similarities in that sense.
Mhm.
I think that sort of shows through in this series because there are certain things where, because that's new knowledge to me that they were all written at the same time, but that now sort of explains, for example, like I feel like Glokta as a character doesn't really do much for the first and second books, and especially in the second book, you're sort of thinking, how is all this happening and he's not doing anything? And then once again, he disappears for like the first 2 acts of
Wisdom of Crowds.
Wisdom of Crowds.
Like, I'm gonna go out to the
I
countryside.
feel like, yeah, he's just having a. Yeah, he's retired. He's
I
having a nice
want
time.
Glokka's holiday so badly. I feel like Glokka and is it no,
Ardy.
yeah, Ardy. I feel like those two going on holiday is like a Bombadil / Goldberry adventure that I want to read. It's the same level of like, I'd watch anything to do with that.
We need a short story.
Mm.
Yes.
What's funny is I'm like, I didn't even disbelieve it. I was like, yeah, Glokta would abandon his daughter and just be like, good luck.
Why would you say that? Glokta was so loyal to her. He was so good to her. He loved her so much.
He was. It was like, I didn't even question. I was like, yeah, sure.
There's something about
Doesn't anymore.
Abercrombie where I believed it as well. I'm like, of course Abercrombie would have it. Of course, there's a horrible person doing horrible things. There's no, whatever he throws at me, I'd be like, absolutely, of course this is happening.
But he was doing it for her sake because he was he's pulling himself away. Anyway, yeah.
Okay, since we're on the topic, I felt so bad for Glokta with how Savine was so cruel to him.
Oh yeah, at the end, absolutely.
Yeah, there's a part of me that really, really empathizes with Savine because okay, so as an adoptive mom, we had to go through classes and we were like emphasized, don't keep this from your child. It is traumatic if your child grows up believing something and then a bomb is dropped on them and then they have to recontextualize everything. Like, adoption is not a shameful thing. You do not have to treat it that way, that kind of thing. And so having gone through all that and then seeing Savine have to go through the exact thing that, I had recounted stories of, I was like, like she is hurting bad for being lied to, for having this father who loved her well, but who now she just finds out that like her world has changed, her perspective has changed. So I sympathized with her, but also she's like pushing her father in a wheelchair, thinking of dumping him off a cliff.
And that shows that Abercrombie understands psychology.
Savine never does things halfway, does she? She would never be like a little bit mad at her father. She's like, no, I will burn the world down.
Yes.
Is that intrusive thoughts?
Yeah.
I wonder if that's
Connect
almost
on it,
like
so
a
that's
nature
something.
versus. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you don't go.
I was going to say, I wonder if it's like a nature versus nurture thing of when we get Glokta's perspective in the first law, he's this deeply bitter, hyperbolic person about every single minor inconvenience. And we see that in Savine, like especially once she has the children and when she's pregnant, she's just completely like miserable and angry all the time. She never lets it like outwardly show, but all her inner monologue is just like, I just have absolutely no enthusiasm for this at all. I hate all of this. I'm so hard done by. And I think that sort of like comes out. Yeah.
That's how I feel every day, and I'm not pregnant. That's sometimes I've just eaten too much and I'm bloated.
I also wonder if I think it's that funny sort of other side of Glokta's character as well, because his method of protecting Savine is very sort of like a tough love kind of thing, but at the same time it's incredibly like self-destructive and toxic. But that's the only way he can understand how to do it, because that's how his world works. Like you can
she takes after
imagine him
so
being
thoroughly.
like, "Oh, I could tell her, and she could keep it a secret."
Yeah.
But then someone, he's a professional torturer. He knows that all someone would have to do is fairly easily get the truth out of her, and then say, "Oh, well, she's heir to the throne," or whatever.
Can we also talk about the other angle of I don't know if anybody else felt this way, but I was loving Savine and Orso until that.
Yeah, because I know that I was with Grace when we read it, and we both definitely did not remember that they were siblings, and so I remember reading it, and I read that bit before Grace, and I was like, the craziest thing has just happened, and I was like, in my head, I was like, how did I forget that happened? Does Grace remember that happened? And I'm gonna look like an idiot.
And the answer is no, absolutely not.
It was a nice shared experience, to be fair.
My dad DNF'd the book when he got to that reveal. He was like, "Don't recommend me another book by this man."
That's it. It was done.
At least they didn't know, unlike George R. R. Martin's characters.
Yeah, at least there's that.
Well, it's funny because when I read the first scenes with them together, I texted Ben immediately and just been like, I wasn't expecting this arc in the new series, and you were like, oh, it took us a while to work to remember that, and I was like, oh, I just put it down immediately, like, yeah, that seems like a fairly Abercrombie thing to do.
I think you'd luckily read them all pretty close back to back.
Absolutely, almost just back to back. Over the course of.
Whereas
I'm trying to think of how long it had been. Like maybe a year and 3 months for me between.
It had been 3 years for me since I read First Law Trilogy. And so I had no recollection.
Bryce, was the reveal a surprise to you?
It was a surprise. It had been like 10 years since I read First Law, so yeah, it was a huge surprise. I'm even now going like, oh, it was in the First Law. I better go reread that.
Yeah, I just totally forgot that there was another child. Like that flew under the radar so thoroughly, like having read the standalones in between, and like that basically like did a factory reset on my memory for the first trilogy.
Which I feel like is a good thing we've gone back to the first book, because we really started at the end. So I was going to say, I was going to put forward the question of who everyone's favorite character is, because I feel like this is divisive.
Can I add to that question? Who was your favorite at the beginning, and who was your favorite at the end?
Okay, thankfully mine doesn't change.
Mine doesn't change either, actually.
King Orso for the win, boys.
I was like, let's go at the same time.
Oh yeah, King Orso.
Savine at first, and then Orso by the end.
I was always
I can get on board with that, but I think for me it's Savine and then Savine. But like Orso was like right up there by the end. But Savine I think was my favorite the entire time, like just because I was so riveted every time I was reading from her, and every time it was one of her chapters, I was like, okay, I'm sad. Like I'm here.
Yes, same. From her introduction with the fan, do you remember what she would like? The way she would flick it or fan herself or whatever, it was all these little minor, like she's so smart. She's so able to control a room. It was such a great introduction for her.
Yeah.
And then she has kind of like a Jaime Lannister like experience, right? And it changes her whole view on everything. So she's
That's a really good
powerful.
point. Because
Yeah,
James
I
is
am.
my favorite too, so maybe you're onto something there.
Yeah. We love a good redemption. It's not really. It's kind of a redemption in a
That's
way.
She stays terrible. Let's be real. I think
It's
that's
the
part of why
closest
she's
to
so
a
great.
redemption that Abercrombie can write.
You know what's
Um,
funny? Oh, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was gonna say about Pete, because you haven't said your favorite, and I feel like Pete's gonna disgust a lot of people with his
no.
favorite at the beginning and end.
Well, this might surprise you. So,
Oh,
on sort of recollection, I feel like I had a different favorite character for each book.
Okay.
First one, I was a big fan of Orso, but especially Orso's like actions around Savine. So like all the stuff of him coming to Valbec to save her. Second book, my favorite character was Leo. And then third, I'm seeing it shaking heads.
I see the disgust.
Yeah,
that's my burden to bear. So,
Yeah.
And then the third book, I think my favorite character was
Rikke.
I'm completely blanking on it now, which is crazy.
yeah, was it Rikke? Or?
It wasn't Rikke. It was.
It's like
Well,
Dan
Well,
Teufel.
it was Rikke, but mostly because of Shivers
Yeah, Shivers
being
was
just
amazing.
my favorite character of the whole,
He's
like all 9 books. But
what is he?
I think
Best served
Rikke-
cold.
yeah, I'm a best served cold Stan.
Me too. Rikke deserves all the love, though. She's an incredible character.
Am I the only one that thinks it's Ricky still?
Is it Rikke?
I say Rikke out loud, but I'm with you, Grace. At the beginning of A Little Hatred, there's a rhyme where it rhymes with Ricky.
Not
and
even just the beginning. They make it through all the books. They're like, oh, Sticky Ricky, Tricky Ricky. I'm like, how can
Yeah.
it rhyme with Sticky and Tricky if it's not Ricky?
Yeah, it can't be Sticky Rikke.
What's,
Ricky?
what was the audio?
everyone
What was the
says
audio
Rikke,
though?
though.
Because I feel like audio
Yeah,
was Rikke.
Pete. What was the audio?
It was Rikke.
It's Rikke, yeah.
It was Rikke.
Wait, I think
Wait,
he
what?
just said something different.
No, he said Rikke. He just said it in English, like a British accent. It sounds
In
different.
English.
In English, yeah.
Was it Rikke or Ricky? I'm so confused.
It's Rikke in the audio, but the rhyme in the book is Ricky.
I'm
So-
sticking with
How does-
Ricky.
How does the audiobook, when the rhyme is being said in the
Oh, it
audiobook?
says Sticky Rikke.
Well, it doesn't
Wait,
rhyme then.
It doesn't rhyme, no. But
That's-
maybe
And the
rhymes-
narrator is just like, I'm committed.
No.
I don't care.
Yeah.
F this. I'm
Yeah,
fixing
the-
one.
Is Stephen Pacey, right, that does the narration?
Maybe
Like,
maybe
I've
it's
been saying Sticky. I've been saying Rikke this whole time. He gets to that line and he's like,
maybe his name's Stephen Paceway or something, and we've been getting it wrong this whole time. Could be.
Stephen Pesa.
I wanna espouse my adoration for King Orso though.
Okay.
He was going into the final trilogy. I didn't think anyone was going to become like Glokta, like Shivers, Dogman, especially Dogman level character. Like I was kind of like, oh, I'll be excited to meet new characters, but I
Yeah.
don't think they're gonna outshine those that pre-existing ones. And also, and Savine, but especially also was one at the end where like his whole arc and the tragedy at the end and everything. I was just like, he's actually possibly my like joint favorite character in the whole First Law universe. I just think like and I think that comes down to Abercrombie's like actual formation. Like I think that because they're all written at the same time, I think even his arc of like a little private hanging and everything, and then at the end you've got a little public hanging, and then at the end you've got a little private hanging. I just think everything done with him
This
is a
so
masterpiece
good.
leading to that. And like yeah, just him at the end. How's
And
your
he never
leg?
liked
Is
them.
is
He
one
never
of the
liked
most
hanging.
iconic lines. Just how's your leg? It's goated.
It is. I was watching an interview with Abercrombie where somebody mentioned Orso being, the one good, noble, wonderful character. And his response was, he didn't get anything done, though. Is he really that good? Like, is it good if you just have nice ideals, but you don't actually benefit anyone?
It's a fair argument.
The typical
Abercrombie
politician.
At the moment.
He's like a Ned Stark in that sense, kind of.
It's interesting that every time he does try to actually tangibly do something good, someone else sort of undoes it. Like when he pardons everyone in Valbec, and then the Inquisition just kills them all
Pike
anyway. And
just
he's like,
murders
no
them
one
all.
told me. No
I
one
think that killed his
told
soul a
me.
little bit.
I went to sleep and 200 people have been hanged. Like, it's crazy.
Well, that's why
Well,
he
you-
hates hanging so much.
Yeah,
You're in his head. You're in his head the whole time, and you're like, okay, he's trying to do good. He's trying to do right, and then he, like, over and over again, they like want to paint him as the bad guy. Just thought it was such a good trope kind of twist on this. Like, you should hate him. You should hate this lazy, good for nothing nobleman who just lives this high life and, you know, doing whatever he wants, including whatever, you know, illicit substances or whatever. And but you're like, but he's so real. He's so honest.
He's like I think like the perfect thing with him is that it's almost like Abercrombie being like, there's a reason you don't have people like him in the rest of the series. It's because people who actually try to do good or are willing to change to be good in this world, they're dead. They get wiped out. So we've never bothered with them before because they're not around. This one luckily happened to be the Crown Prince, so we had to really do something with him. But if he was just a normal person, he's dead in Valbec. Like there's nothing happening. And I like there's an interesting idea of like he's the only character that has any kind of.
I think there's an interesting parallel there that I didn't really think of until now to be drawn with the Dog Man, because like I think it's the whole theme of like bureaucracy versus like the North has an entirely different way of doing things and an approach to life. So somebody who is like a noble character up there can actually like get stuff done. I don't know. Because I always kind of thought that about him. I'm like, well, yeah, good people don't tend to thrive, but like he was always a good person. And I think it's just because the North that like, I don't know, killing people isn't exactly viewed as a character flaw up there. And it makes all the difference.
I also think that he's honorable, which also isn't really. But Dogman, I think the North kind of prides itself on this kind of perverse sense of honor.
Yeah. That's true.
And I think Dogman is an honorable man. I think people look up to the Dogman as like, you know, even Downside can look at the Dogman, and Downside's there like, he looked at me funny. It looked feudy. I love that line so much that it looked feudy to me and just kills the guy. And I think that's like, someone as flawed as that can look at Dogman and be like, that is a virtuous hero I see before me. And whereas also because he's like, everyone looks at him and goes, do you remember when that guy used to like just hang around with prostitutes and Tunny? You know, like there couldn't be a worse combination.
I think
Tunny's been consistently the best forever.
Tunny and Yoke are great.
Most consistent character in the whole series.
But actually, I would like to change my answer for the third book because I remembered what it
back
was
to Leo
before I panicked. It's not back to Leo, unfortunately, but it's actually Savine for the third one. If only for in the final act where she just completely undercuts Leo because she at that point has such an understanding of his failings as a person that she just wins out. She doesn't even put that much effort into it. She literally just gets what's his name from the hero, not the heroes, Red Country, the lawyer.
Oh, Cadia. I think that's the same.
I know who you're talking about, but I don't remember his name.
It's the lawyer.
It's the prosecutor, right? Yeah.
Who was my favorite character in that book, so that's fun. It's nice to have him back. But I like that she just draws up a contract and Leo just straight up, President Schwarzenegger, I'm elected to lead, not to read. He just doesn't bother reading it. And suddenly she's like, oh, by the way, I like control half the country. And he's like, what? No one told me this. How did this happen? It's in the contract.
The interesting thing with that as well, because it harkens back to the first book, where like Merphy was saying, like she just effortlessly controls everyone, and it's like by the end of the third one, you're like, Well, of course, it takes her absolutely zero brain power to beat Leo Dan Brock, one of the stupidest and most gullible men to ever exist in any form. Like, he's one of the most pitiful characters I've ever read in my entire life.
He
And
is a train wreck tragedy the entire time.
And the great line when Savine's like, you may not be the villain, but you're certainly not the hero, is just the perfect, like, talk about kicking a man in the leg. And Leo only has one, so it's really bad for him.
Like, you're actually not important. You're nothing.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so rough.
But which is why it was so much. I mean, just her taking apart the lawyer, the prosecutor, was just brilliant. I mean, and just that's why I think that was even more like to then also she's gonna take apart Leo Dan Brock, but like when she really takes apart the lawyer and makes him kind of the laughing stock amidst a place where if you are against him, you're gonna be next on the chopping block. Like, it was so brilliantly done.
Did anyone else has everyone seen Oppenheimer?
No.
Yeah.
I
won't with you. So.
No, I'm not gonna lie. Go for it.
Spoilers for Oppenheimer. It reminds me of Emily Blunt in the scene where she's talking to the prosecutor in that, and she, like, it's that scene where it's kind of you like they think that she's not going to do well, and then suddenly she just like destroys this guy, and that's how Savine is with Swarbrick, where you're just like, man, you chose the wrong person. You go back to writing your romances, brother. You're done for here.
About this trilogy in particular that I really liked is that Abercrombie has this sort of self-deprecating hatred of writers, like especially in Swarbrick and when they're trying to come up with the Constitution and all that stuff, and it's just a sort of playground for him to make fun of himself and all his friends.
That is his humor.
Yeah.
I think he does a really good job of making Orso sympathetic as well. Like, you brought up really good points about perception of him and how all the things that he did that made people think that he's worthless, but we're in his head and we see his intentionality. But also in his relationship with Savine, we see him doting on her and throwing himself at her feet, and like how true he is, how honest his feelings are. And he's like, I'm going to be a better person. I'm turning my life around. Like, you are my future, and how earnest he is. And then we understand what Savine understands, but when he gets that letter that's just so short, it's like the worst breakup letter that has ever been written between siblings, I'm pretty sure. I felt so bad for him. It's like, I'm not pro incest, but also could you, like, what are we doing here?
Well, and that trope drives me nuts, because I'm like, they could have communicated. Come on. Like, that was one where I was just like, they just absolutely couldn't have a sit down talk after all they've been through, and like, it was just like, mom doesn't want it. Like, you listen to your mom.
I was okay with that purely from like Savine's perspective, where she's like, I may physically vomit if I see him. Like, I am so disgusted with myself and him, even though we didn't know about it, that, do you know what? I feel really bad. Anyone who is in an incestuous relationship who watches this video, they're going to feel really bad based on the comments we're making. Get off the video.
We feel bad about that.
Well, I was just thinking, I was like, man, it must be really bad for them sat at home if they're like, damn, they don't like me.
I didn't know that. Considered not okay.
Well, Savine was also making the consideration of like protecting the secret, right? Like, she didn't want to go sit down and explain things to him, partly because she did not want to, like, nothing she wants less in the world, but also like they didn't want to tell him, right? Like, they didn't want to spread this knowledge any further, because it was basically the right down to the wire, like, she shared that information when she absolutely had to in the third book, right?
And circling back to Savine, my sympathy for her and how she responded learning all this stuff, like, it was so much more layered than just, I'm adopted. It was like, also, I've been doing this with my brother. That super sucks. Someone could have told me.
Yeah.
Lots of trauma.
I was gonna give a shout out to the mothers, Ardy and Finri. Yeah, Finri.
I love Finri.
Those two, so good. Yeah, I suppose because Ardy is great from the. I loved her in the original trilogy as well. And so like her in this, that meeting when they kind of have their conversation, they're like, "That's it, you two are getting married," and like them two working together was such a great scene, and both of them. I just love it. I love that it reveals a lot about the kids from them two talking. Where like Leo's like, my mummy's done what? What do you mean she's done this behind my back? And Savine's like, wonderful. She's made a business deal, and I'm. It's such a just sums up them perfectly.
The funny thing is that's the scene that I think cemented Leo as my favorite character in the second book. Just I was so here for this man who just has absolutely no idea about the nuances of life besides
steamrolled left
being
and right.
attractive, fancying all your friends, and hitting people with swords. Like suddenly he's like, "I'm getting married." Oh no!
And he frustrated me so much with Durand, or however you say it, because it was the first paragraph of the first scene, and I messaged Ben and I was like, "This guy's in love with his friend."
Yeah. You can't hyperfixate on a man's jawline that much without giving the game away.
Yeah, like he's talking about like riding into battle gloriously in like those first pages, but just in among this is wow, he's so beautiful.
Yeah. I wish I was wrestling that man in the mud. It's like he's having such fun with it. It's like, but it's so sad because it starts that way, and you're like, oh, this would be a wonderful development. I'm sure Abercrombie's going to go through with that, and then like just the fall of that man into being horrendously self-hating. And like the bit where, like, because of course in the second book you've got when they go to Styria and see Japo, and like that scene is like so sad where he leaves Durand behind, and Anwar I think is the other guy, and then in the third book where he's just like, men shouldn't be doing that with each other type thing. It's such like a it seems to me it's like super 1980s British politician being anti-gay legislation and then finding out that they've been like having these affairs behind their back. And it's like it's the exact I feel like Abercrombie has to have pulled from that, in the sense of like that's going to be my character. He's the worst politician that's ever existed ever.
Well, I definitely think it would be like too kind for an Abercrombie book for it to be like, oh, Durand and I can't remember his name either because
Anwar. Yeah, I think it is Anwar.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the Abercrombie like charm, where he takes like Leo should, like in a traditional fantasy book, would be like, I think, like the main protagonist that you root for, and then he like twists him in the Abercrombie fashion for that kind of trope and made him what he is. Apparently a favorite in one of the books. No, I was kidding.
In the book where he starts a civil war, it's an odd choice.
Leo's just so like, the reason that he frustrated me so much all three books is that he just like, I don't know if he was actually like, I don't feel like he was actually dumb, but I just feel like he was not ever forming his own opinions like about anything. Somebody would say something to him and he would be like, oh yeah, you're right. And they'd be like, do you want to do this politically? And he would be like, I definitely shouldn't think about that deeper than surface level. Like, I'll go with what you're saying. And then they're manipulating him, and then he would be like, oh man, I should learn from this. And then he would do it again immediately.
He's a human Labrador. Yeah. Like you put a rope in front of him and he's chasing it, and you throw a tennis ball and he's like, he doesn't even remember a rope existed. He's completely gone. Like he's the most
throw the tennis ball and he's
you fake throw him a kingdom and he's like, oh my god, I'm gonna kill everyone. And his naivety as well, because like also I think that's brilliant with Leo and Savine, where in that bit where they have the civil war. And Leo's like, well, we're just going to we're going to replace Orso. We're not like Orso's going to stay. He'll still be king. We're just going to replace the close. This is all about the close council. And Savine's like, you are the biggest idiot that I've ever met. Of course, Orso has to go. He completely undermines everything. If you think Orso's just going to stay there with, you just remove his office, and then you're like, oh yeah, he could stay. And that's what I mean. Orso's like the opposite of a himbo, where like he's like he's like the most evil himbo that's ever existed, where he's like kind of dopey, he's kind of likable, and he's been led to being the most evil man in the realm.
Well, I think the way I read it in all three books is that Leo is essentially the opposite side of the same coin as Orso.
Yeah,
they're both fundamentally not, well, sort of functionally, they're both quite easily led one way or another by advice, be it good or bad. But also, Orso is self-aware. He knows he's not very smart at times. He knows he's impulsive. He knows his flaws. Whereas Leo is just adamant that he has none. He's the least self-aware character, which is why when anyone feeds him an idea, he's immediately like, I've had this brilliant idea.
Yeah, that's a really good observation, though, because Leo is so hateable, and a lot of that is that belief that like I'm always right. And Orso is a lot more humble and willing to take other people's counsel and recognize his flaws and try to improve. But Leo doesn't see any need for improvement.
Well, I think that's why it's so satisfying, especially in the third book, to see people like undermining Leo using that same methodology, because he never learns. So they're like, oh, we could just convince this guy of anything. He's so gullible.
Yeah. Which I suppose, well, actually, I suppose with that, he does eventually learn, and he learns in the worst way, which is he hatches his own plan, which is the most evil thing that's ever existed. Where he like, it's such a great speech where also it's like, you know what, I'm going to give back to the people. I'm going to take power away from the closed council. And he's describing this utopian visage. And I remember as that speech started, I was like, stop talking about it. Just do it. Because if you keep talking about it, and he was dead. And I was like, you idiot. You kept talking about it. And
call my boy an idiot.
Yeah. Oh, man. I actually, no. I was going to say there are 2 times where I teared up. One time I actually cried, which I did not expect in an Abercrombie book. Which I don't know whether anyone wants to take a trip up to the north for a crying session to get away from Leo's evilness.
Let's cry.
The Dogman dying and Shivers' speech. Shivers' speech genuinely made me tear up, and I was sat there like, they were the best, you know. And it's like, and Shivers is essentially like Dogman's adoptive son in the sense of like making that man like better. And like after how he is in that trilogy, that middle trilogy where he like starts off with this idea of like, I'm going to be a better person, and just loses it as it goes along. And then, well, I suppose at the end he kind of reclaims it slightly where he doesn't kill Logan. But then, yeah, having that time gap and then being like, oh, he hung out with Dogman, and Dogman's natural existence as a great person made Shivers a great like surrogate father, almost like an uncle figure. He like looked after everyone, and like he's there at the end. And man, Shivers was so fantastic. And his speech where he just talks about Dogman making him a better person. I was just like, Dogman really was the best.
I think that's an interesting like subversion of a trope, where obviously we have from Rikke's perspective, she talks a lot about how she was essentially raised by Shivers, nursed by Shivers in some cases. And I think the trope would typically be, oh, this character's like very rough around the edges. It's the Hound character, right? You know, you got this kind of like bloodthirsty, cold, very like standoffish character. And it's like, oh, and then we give them a child to look after, and they suddenly become really. I like the idea that he'd already had that arc by the time Rikke was born. Like he'd just been hanging around with Dogman, and Dogman just made him better, or at least helped him get less. You know, it sort of helped him along after that final scene in Red Country, where you sort of maybe see that he's falling back into the like, okay, maybe I should try and be a better person. and then going and finding Dogman, becoming better, so that by the time Rikke comes along, he's already in that place where he's like, I could definitely look after your child. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Shivers is just great.
He
Shivers.
is.
That was the bit I cried at one of these books. I can't remember which book it's in, but where Rikke has a vision, which I firmly believe are Shivers' last words.
Mm.
And it was,
Oh, it's the first book.
Yeah. And so I was waiting for that scene for the whole rest of the series, just being like, oh God, when's Shivers going to die? Oh no. And then it never happens, which I think ties into a much larger thing that I'd like to talk to, maybe talk about later, about how Rikke's visions are done so well.
Oh yeah.
And
I was gonna
the purpose they play in the plot.
Quickly before that, I was gonna say I think we do see Shivers' death in the series, in that book. Because I think you are right. I think that the vision he had, like, because it's they're on a mountain and he's like saying like essentially goodbye, but then that doesn't happen. And then in the end of the third book, the very last chapter where it's kind of going through like there were the two kids, and it's like the essentially it's telling you like, oh, the world's gonna get destroyed again, essentially. What's his name? What's the guy from the north?
Clover.
No. The
Black Holder.
Yeah, Black Holder's son. They talk about him. He has. No, the one at the very end, the one in the vision.
That one.
Yeah, they talk about him being in like a river of blood, and he's got the sword. Well, I know it doesn't have to be the same sword, but he's got the same sword that Shivers has, and I think that it's saying that he's going to kill Shivers, and that whole scene is eventually in the future, because she doesn't like talk about it, that Rikke's going to be there when Shivers dies, and this guy takes his sword, and then like we're going to have that whole thing happen as like. So I think we do see Shivers die, just subtextually in visions, which was very sad. But I thought that end scene was crazy. But yeah, visions.
I think that's like a big foil for Rikke as a character, is that her entire support network are about 40 years older than her. So by the time that Black Holder's sort of second child is old enough to basically take over the world, it's not a surprise that like he could kill Shivers, because by then Shivers would be in his 60s. Like, and this idea is like, oh, it makes sense that the North basically collapses under Rikke's rule, because after a while, all of her like baseline of support just die of old age, or
in their 60s.
It's like old age in the North, very young.
60s in the
I feel
first
like they're
war.
gonna die of swords.
And they're all dying of smoke inhalation from the factories.
That's true, yeah, they're all going to have that industrial revolution lung.
Bryce, though, you mentioned Clover, and I feel like we should give Clover his props for a few minutes, like just for a minute, because like he was such a great character. Every time we went to him throughout the entire series, just like such an entertaining perspective to be in.
Some of the best lines. I can't think of them.
I was honestly waiting for Bryce.
Sorry, I didn't get some of the best lines. He's fun. He's just, I can't even think of any right now off the top of my head, but he was just, because he's just, you can't trust him. Well, and there, everyone's like, you can trust him in knowing that he's going to do whatever's best for him. And that's the best way to trust him. And really, frankly, at least you kind of can predict his outcome. Whereas like, as opposed to, I don't know, I wasn't like, I remember being kind of mad at Savine's kind of double crossing, right? But I completely excused it for Rikke, because I was like, well, she's the one getting double crossed, and so then she double crosses. I just thought that whole part was great. But anyway, I'm jumping ahead. But Clover, great Abercrombie character, just like a stellar one.
Yeah.
Clover may have done one of the worst things in any of the books, though. When he killed Wonderful, I was like, you, sir, have gone not only a step too far, you've run like 100 meters past that line. Like, I was
such a shock too.
It was crazy, and it lulls you into it, because of course, like, you've already had him turn on that other guy, and you're like, oh, that's the moment for Clover. and then you get a second, like, way worse moment, and I think that's what took me by surprise. That I was like, "We're done. Clover's made his." Well, she killed Wonderful. Like, she was the best.
Well, I think it speaks a lot to how great a character both characters Wonderful and Clover are in that first book, especially. Simply because by the end of it, after that scene happens, talking about it once I'd finished the book, I was like, up until that point, Clover was my favorite character. And that scene is so heartbreaking that it basically undoes all the goodwill that you get from what is essentially like the best, funniest, like wittiest character from the whole like series. It would be like if Tunny decided to like.
Yeah, it's like if Tunny killed Yolk.
Exactly.
You know, you'd
like
be like,
Hildy.
Yeah. You'd be like, that's the most evil.
Well, because there is that scene in the third book where Tunny and Hildy have this sort of like they play out this scenario in which they like hate each other and he like they have to fight, and I was like, you can't be wonderfuling me again.
Yeah.
But then it turns out it's like all for show, and I was like, oh god, you couldn't do that to me twice.
I hated that he killed Wonderful, like that hurt me, but I also just thought it was so well done on Abercrombie's part, because I feel like until this point we're just getting the little sprinkles of like what Clover considers to be his past or like the person that he used to be, but we're like, well, you're a lazy, like, I don't know, sword teacher now who's just sarcastic. But he keeps being like, you have to just don't fight, just pick your moment. And then like he says that all the time, and then every time throughout the series he's like, I keep telling you have to pick your moment, and then he murders somebody and you're like, okay, well, you really took your own lessons to heart.
And he ends up in the most perfect position where he's training with Baez at the end, and it's like that straight back to the first scene where he's there and he's like, what's the first rule of like fighting? It's like and it's the idea of like, if you don't take your sword out, you've won, essentially. Like if you never have to fight, then you're a winner. And it's like something about that. And he just sits back down and he's just there kind of like playing with his thumbs or something. And there's just something about that image coming back at the end where it's like, man, how did that work out? How did he do that?
Well, I think it sort of sums Clover up as almost like the smartest Northman in the series, just from that, like from the outset, where he basically says, if you pull out your sword, you've already lost. And the guy's like, oh, well, what if I'm in a battle? And he's like, well, if you're in a battle, you've lost even more.
You're even further.
The idea is just like avoid at all costs, like putting yourself in danger, and it makes perfect sense that he survives all the way to the end.
Yeah.
But I also really liked that in the third one, he does reveal this. Oh, he hasn't like lost his edge. Yeah. Like he's still like one of the best swordsmen in the world. He's just smart enough not to like bother.
Yeah. He's quite happy with that scene in the. Sorry to go all the way back to the first one, but the scene where he kills that guy and he just runs back into the woods and he's like, "This guy's dying," and he's like, "Well, he's dead. I may as well." They're quite far away now. The battle's already started. I'll probably. Do you need like help, like packing stuff up? We'll probably be going. It's like he's the perfect coward, but not a coward in the sense of like he fears it. He's a coward in the sense of that he'd rather be doing anything but. Like
I was going to say it's because it would be work.
Yeah, exactly.
Effort.
He's like I am. He's such a He's almost like he's the perfect depiction of a lecturer, where it's like this person has all the knowledge and everything, and he's like, I don't want to apply any of this. I'm going to be really happy telling you how you should be doing it. And like, there's something great about that. He's a perfect teacher in the sense of like, or like a master that's just he's completely done with it.
It's sort of the opposite of those who can't teach.
Exactly, yeah. It's like I can do it so well that I know this is pointless.
In a sense, he's like the North's answer to Nick McCosker. There's a very much a sense of like, why would I fight when I don't have to?
Yeah. Yeah, and
but
it's
also
like
still having that sort of ruthless edge, like when he killed. Is it Greenway? No. It's like Stour Nightfall's
Oh.
second in command, where he's like,
Yeah.
he just immediately sees his moment, just stabs him with an arrow, and he's like, oh, he's been shot.
Yeah.
How did this happen?
I was going to say,
Okay.
yeah, it's interesting with Koska, because Koska's just more Koska Clover would be happy if no one died, in the sense of if everyone put their swords down and everyone chilled out, he'd be more than happy. Koska actively wanted people to die for him, I would say, is the big difference. Like, Koska was like, I need to be in charge of this big troop, and so I can espouse myself and tell everyone how clever I am while they die for me. Like, I think he needed that as part of his like actual self, whereas like Clover was just like, I mean, there's nothing else going on. This is the main industry of the North, you know. Like, it's like if someone got into like biomed now and they're not really interested in it, but they just do it because that's kind of like the big field. You know, he's kind of like, I don't really care about it, but this is how I make my living. And so I think like that's what makes Clover fun for me.
Business.
Yeah.
Well, and he
I
doesn't
don't know
have that honor, right? That North honor that we talked about, you know. And same with like Koska, he's a mercenary leader, right? Like, they're in it to fight more so that he gets more money, and like you said, have them die for him.
They
I
have
do-
the honor of, my concern is how I'm doing and the fact that I survive.
I do like that sort of self-serving, complete almost detachment from a lot of the ideals of the North comes back to bite him in the form of Downside, who I thought I loved. Like, all his interactions with Downside were
Yeah.
great, but I do love just when Downside turns on him just for the sake of, look, I just cannot keep up with you changing sides all the time. He's like, oh, just can't keep
Well,
up.
They're just such polar opposites, because like we mentioned earlier, like if a leaf blew at Downside wrong, he would try and murder the tree, you know?
Man, Downside may be a great.
So
He's one of the great characters as well. Do you know what it is? Downside is Leo Dan Brock to Clover's kind of Savine-esque character. Like, there's a thinker and then there's a doer, and Downside is a doer in all the sense of the words. He is a
Okay. I don't want to like cut off this, but I just wanted to say there are two POV characters that we have not talked about at all yet, and they're kind of both involved in the same storyline that we haven't touched on that much, and that's Vick and Gunner.
I'm ready to go on Gunner, because I think I have a different opinion than Gunner to everyone. Because I think a lot of people have Gunner as one of their least favorites out of the series. I don't know how anyone else felt, but I feel like that's a view
I
I've
like
seen.
him. I like him. Like, I get like the struggles that he went through, you know, when he's like having to, you know, the wisdom of crowds, like have this like existential crisis every single day. But he like goes along with it, but you're like, it's so human, right? I mean, you're like, what would you do in that situation? Like, how do you toe the line unless you're just willing to die? Like, there's no middle ground here. And so I absolutely I liked him a lot, because he was just kind of like the man that did, but then finally he thought, but he's just such a realistic person, right? Like,
I completely agree. Yeah, like I really liked him too, like not as a favorite above the other characters, but I think he was probably the saddest character in the entire series, just because of what he struggled with, like just the, I don't know, I guess like mental health struggles and like all the anger issues, and like the fact that he wanted to be a better person, but he like didn't fully deep down believe it. Like, he believed always that he would go back to this like vice, and then like you said, Bryce, when he's having the existential crisis, like just leaning into that darkest side, and like
well,
just
he's an
really,
addict,
really
I think,
sad.
you know? Yeah. He's an addict. And I work with addicts all the time, and you're just like, I mean, the ones that can pull themselves out of it, I find to be some of the most brave, courageous people that I know, because it's difficult and it's so hard. And there comes a point where you're like, yeah, you got yourself into it, but at the same time, like, can we keep blaming them for it? And I mean, I don't know. So it's just very complex character that I absolutely just yeah, not as, I mean, it's just Orso and Savine are just so hard to beat.
Yeah. I was going to say, like, you bringing up the addiction and the vice and stuff, because that's what got me. Like the scene at the end of Wisdom of Crowds when his wife walks in and he just bursts into tears, and like that made me cry as well. Like that one got me back, because like coming from a family with addictions, it was like it was one of the rawest approaches to addiction I've ever read, in the sense of like, and I don't think people view it as an addiction story mostly, but it's such a complex and nuanced like addiction story. And yeah, like I think all the way through he's so frustrating, in the sense of that you can see him becoming a better person if he could, and then that third book where he just falls into it and he's just addicted to the violence and he's kind of resigned to it. And then yeah, just that final scene. I don't think Gunnar would be one of my favorites unless he had that scene where he breaks down to his wife and then is immediately like, Savine is essentially like, you're going to go back to doing it, like you may as well accept it. And it's just such, he's the biggest tragedy out of the entire series for me. Like Orso is a tragedy, but Broad is just such a tragic character. And like whenever I think about that scene, I'm just like, man, it's ridiculously
Sad.
so full of emotion. And I think that's one of the things I loved about this series so much, is that it did get so much genuine emotion out of me that a lot of other Abercrombie work hasn't to date. It's like it's had moments, but this had real like emotional reactions of like tears from me.
I don't think that's a character I really put much thought into, but y'all have got me thinking a little bit different on him.
I think going back to the very beginning, it's so sad that he, like, who's to say what his trajectory would have been, but the theme of the entire series of like the Industrial Revolution is what comes and destroys his home and pulls him straight back into all of this, right? Like he could have genuinely been getting better if he could have just lived on his like farm with his family, but nobody let him do that.
Yeah. And then I suppose that leaves Vick.
It sure does.
Vick was a very interesting character throughout. Also has a tragic aspect, but Vick was like consistently brilliant all the way through.
Yes.
And like, and I think that's why she goes undervalued, because it's kind of like what you were saying when you think about Trouble with Peace, where like it was just consistent, so you don't really think about it as much. I think Vick is the same, where all the way through I was so interested with her storyline that she was just constantly like, oh yeah, well Vick, I love to read a Vick chapter, but it wasn't like it didn't hit the same heights as others, but it was just so brilliant. And
or lows.
Yeah, very much so. And yeah, Vick's journey through, one of the, I was talking to Pete about it. One of the things I loved was that Vick has this journey of like, she has this perverse sense of loyalty, but how can you be loyal when the people you're loyal to aren't loyal? And it's like, to who they're loyal to, who do you end up? And it's kind of like, it's very Downside-esque, where he turns on Clover, because he's like, I just can't keep up. And it's like Vick is there and she's like, I'm loyal to Glokta, but who's Glokta loyal to? What's going on here? And like I really loved the subterfuge and all of that kind of spy-esque storyline that you get from her, that I thought worked pretty well, and had the tragedy at the end where it turns out, what's the kid that runs Tallow? That got me as well. I'm like, are you telling me Tallow, this little kid has been he's been snitching on her this entire time? God, that got me. I was not pleased with that young boy. I understood, but I'd have a stern word. It was real, man. She deserved better than that. She did, however, get the great moment with oh, I forgot his name. The high pitched boy.
Oh, Gris.
Yeah, Gris. Her fight with like working with Gorst and stuff was a great fight scene.
So good.
And everything with Gorst was great, but
especially on audiobook, it's funny.
Oh, did you do the audios as well?
Yeah. The high pitched voice.
Ghost is fun, man. It's so good.
I never really thought about what he would have sounded like in the audiobooks, like the complete
Squeakiness.
like disconnect between.
So he actually went for it with the squeaky voice.
Oh,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean-
he fully commits.
Wow.
He sounds like
It throws you off every time, though. You're like, oh yeah.
Because I heard certain parts, and one of the funniest lines I heard when Pete was listening to it is when Gorst sees Leo and they're like fighting, and he's like, "Tell your mother I respect her a lot." Type thing. And I think like they're funny lines, but sometimes the way that he delivered Gorst's voice and like Leo's reaction, where he's like, because firstly that's hilarious with Leo and Gorst, where Leo's like, "I'm going to meet the bravest man in this entire realm. He's a hero," and then it's just Gorst being like, "Come on in, it's time to go up there." And it's just everything, and it never gets old. That joke never gets
I thought
old.
it would get old, especially because you've had other books with it, and then it's just it's so hilarious.
Well, I think that says a lot about, because one of the parts of the book that I obviously it was an interesting one, because I liked it and hated it at the same time, is Gorst's death, where he goes out and is sort of like blaze of glory, but at the same time, I think Durand is the only character who hears him speak and just has absolutely no response, because I think at that point Durand is like, this guy, just come on, just like, I think a lot of characters like hear about Gorst's like deeds and like the amazing stuff that he does, and he's, he's the greatest swordsman ever, and then they hear the voice and they're like, really? Whereas Durand has just seen him kill like 20 people and like been shot at least 4 times by then. He's like, I don't care what he sounds like. I just want to. Can he just die, please?
Shoots him in the face.
Yeah.
Or maybe he was so shocked by Gorst's voice, he accidentally shot. And then
he was actually going to let him go.
Yeah. He was going to let him kill Leo, and then was like, "Oh God."
Abercrombie has mentioned that he might do a 3rd trilogy following yet another generation, which I normally am like, no, end it on a high note. But I don't know. I feel like I have enough trust in Abercrombie at this point that I'm like, yeah.
We needed to get to like the Mistborn, where it's going to get to like Wild West and then science fiction. Just kidding.
Well, we've done Wild West kind of already.
Actually, because I suppose like if you were going to do another trilogy, it's kind of been spoiled by that vision at the end, which kind of takes you through the rest of the history of what's going to happen.
True.
So, I suppose like because the kind of the idea of that final vision is that Ayers destroys everything almost. From what I took from it is that Ayers rises again and destroys everything. So I think it would be interesting to go to like Bronze Age, and rather than go forward in time, we go and we've got like a Bronze Age civilization, and like we go backwards. I think that would be.
I mean, he could write a book about like the history of the mages and like the conflicts that happened back then.
It would be.
Merphy, I wanted to go to your point though about like the trust in Abercrombie, because something that I don't think I've realized until recently is that it might be just a mark of people who become my favorite authors that I am like you, where I generally am I don't know, nervous, I guess, of like a next generation type of story where I'm like, well, do they have the talent to do it well enough that we're actually going to care? But I feel like when you look at like Daniel Abraham with the Long Price Quartet, and like Robin Hobb with The Realm of the Elderlings, and like Joe Abercrombie with like his trilogies, I'm like, you know what? All of these people who are my absolute favorites have become so partly through like showing that they can do this so well, and that their skill shines through. Like they can still make you care. They can still write fantastic characters.
That's a really
epic
interesting
fantasy,
point,
right?
because-
Both of you talked at the same time.
I know, right? So I was just saying, and it's epic fantasy. I just feel like it makes that kind of as part of what makes it epic is like really going through generations.
That's true. Yeah.
Because I was going to say that I think going back to everything's got to be about Sanderson, right?
Sorry, before you go, also the Greenbone Saga, multi-generational.
Oh yeah.
Anyway,
I
So
was
good.
going to say that, like, yeah, you mentioning the idea of like the like generational thing and having trust makes me think of like my opinion on Mistborn Era 1 to Era 2, where I think a lot of the reoccurring characters in Mistborn Era 2 were the reason that I don't like Mistborn Era 2, because I felt that their he changed their characters in fundamental ways that I was like, you're undoing work for me. And I think like the character
Oh, I thought you just did like Void.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Worst character. I'm actually, I have a T-shirt with Hoyt's name on it. I'm such a fanboy of that guy. But yeah, like I don't want to say anything about Mistborn Era 2, but I agree with you. Like Abercrombie nailed this, and I think because one thing that I really enjoyed is that Dogman is not referred to as Dogman quite a lot. He's mostly referred to as Rikke's father, and it's like all of these like Leo Danbrock's mother, and it's like they're not referred to as the like the nostalgia. Here they are. Look at the grand return type thing. It's like Leo's mum came out and she kept on saying that you don't know what you're doing with this whole battle thing. And you turn around and you're like, well, of course it's Finri. You have to listen to her. And from his perspective, he's like, that's my mum, and she won't shut up. And like I think he does that so well in the sense of
I agree. It would have been so easy for him to just be like, all right, Glokta's here, you know, and like really just fan service, play off of the fact that we love these characters and we'll take slop if you put the characters in it. But instead, he was like, they're in the background. I have new voices to tell. And he did it so well.
Yeah,
exactly.
And he also does it amazingly well with Glokta, where I think the first time you hear the word Glokta is where Savine is talking to someone, and she's like, "My name's Savine," and shakes his hand, and it's like Dan Glokta, and it's like the look on this guy's face, like he just turns like milk white, and it's like such a perfect use for it's like it's not the character, it's the power of that name from that character that is the important thing in this series. And
but we also learned that it's the power of Savine's name too.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because like she's got her own, like she is her before we meet her. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like
she's terrifying in her own right.
Yeah, exactly.
I will say too, though, I want to see what Abercrombie kind of can do outside of First Law, like a little more, you know, like because you know he's still mentioning Logan Nine Fingers in this book, right? And I love Logan. But it is one of those, like, I want to see like more, because we still get those same great quotes that I seriously use in my everyday life. I literally will be like to my kids, well, it's better to do a thing than to live with the fear of it. They don't get it and think that it's as clever as I do. But I love those quotes. But at the same time, I'm like, I want to see what more he can do. But I love this world. So I also want to see this.
Well, we have the Devils coming, and we're all going to read that together.
I'm excited for that one.
We only got a whole year to wait.
Well, I think
it's really rude of him, isn't it?
Is it May 2025? Is that when it's supposed
to be?
May
2025, yeah.
I know.
I think if
he's an author that it doesn't matter what he puts out, I'll read it.
I think if there was to be a third series, obviously we have that essentially like glimpse into the future at the end of Wisdom of Crowds. But we only really see that future from the perspective of the North and a little bit of the Union. Whereas something that I thought was an interesting, almost like slightly disappointing thing about this trilogy was after becoming quite invested in like Monza and Styria through the standalones, they don't play much of a role in this trilogy, which makes sense because it's about, you know, a civil war followed by civil unrest.
Yeah, they're kind of mentioned
quite contained. But I think possibly a third series that focuses more on Styria and like Westport and that sort of part of the world, essentially watching the apocalypse from the outside.
That's exactly what I was thinking when we mentioned a different series as well. I thought Styria, because it does feel like it's ripe, and they would also be in the position almost of the Union, where they are now the big power in the world, and so it's almost like you're switching that perspective to that, and yeah, I agree with that.
We also never even talked about Zuri and her brothers, because I've always been interested in like the South and the is it the Prophet and the Eaters? Like
Yeah.
Yeah.
they just give you the little hints of that and how you should fear it.
We defeated him last time, you know.
Yeah, that
I also
scene
love-
was crazy.
Yeah, well, I was also going to say is when Baez is just like, yeah, I've been dealing with my brothers. Like I've been in the South, and it's crazy that like all of this crazy stuff between essentially magic gods have been fighting, and like that's been going on in the background while we've been watching Leo. Like, what's going on? But
Like the old
and Leo's like, "Who's this old man? I don't care about you."
yeah. But I was going to say I would like to go. So I was going to actually go back to what Grace was saying. I also love that scene because from the first book, I was like, oh, Zuri's going to be an eater. I can't wait for this. And I was waiting the entire time. And Abercrombie does a brilliant thing where essentially in the third book, he goes, don't you think it's a little messed up of you that you saw one person from that place and thought they had to be an eater? And I was like, he's right. Like, that is true. I have essentially profiled her where I assume has to be an eater, and then he goes, ha, 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 she is one. you absolutely tricked me. And that scene was crazy. And the only issue I had with that scene, and I know Pete shares the same opinion, I wanted Shanked to fight Sulfur so badly. That was my game bowl from Best Served Cold when Shanked is there with Sulfur, and they have that little bit at the end where you could tell there's history and bad blood between them. I was like, man, Shanked versus Sulfur, that's it. And it doesn't happen. And Shanked's teased in the second book. And I'm like, where's Shanked? I wanted Shanked to kill.
There was a criminal lack of Shanked.
There was a lack of, and Vitari. They both had great scenes, but I wanted more Shanked than Vitari personally.
We need more books, Joe.
Sorry, I feel.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yeah. We
Bryce, can you corroborate that Vitari possibly has the worst voice in the series? Like,
yeah, that was a rough one. It's a rough one.
It's a weird choice.
It's just
lucky
you're like
it's the only bad voice in the.
Otherwise, honestly, Pacey's amazing at some. It's like some narrators will do like the old man voice, and then that's the voice for anyone who's old. You know, and at least they were distinct. And
yeah, he has this
right. It was like
there is a unique sound to every single character, and part of me just wonders: did he run out of voices?
He could have.
Just like, this is kind of like the least interesting character, so I'll just give her like my worst voice. And
it's Vitari like the last character in order of appearance to appear.
Yeah. He's like, what part of the world have I not done an accent from? East Asia, and it's like, you shouldn't have done it. You shouldn't have done it, brother.
East Asia for Vitari.
Vitari is I would consider it a racist voice. Honestly, it is. It's quite bad. And
I think
it's very
2000s to it. So there's parts where it sounds like a just quite sort of affectation of like East Asia, but there are parts where it sounds almost like diasporic, like with a bit of like sort of London Cockney in it.
Yeah, that's true.
That more sort of comes out when she's in Best Served Cold, where she's obviously in it for longer. And I think maybe he was like, could I play around with this voice a bit? You know, tone it down.
I don't know if this is worse. But I was just listening to Oathbringer, and there's like a kind of a southern drawl accent that Michael Kramer does for this one character, and I'm like, this just doesn't fit into fantasy. I don't know. It's just like
what character's got the southern drawl?
It was the one he's with. He's like talking back to Dalinar, He's like one of the guards from Bridge 13, and I'm blanking on his name, and I have every other detail apparently.
I've yet to reread Oathbringer, so I don't remember who that is. I
I
just
don't have it
finished
on
Knights of
me
Radiance.
here.
I love to imagine that now. I say,
He's like-
a child has gotten loose.
Because it's when
How would they sound like?
Is that what he said? Is that the exact line? I don't know what Southern
Lord
Girl
Leghorn, Ben?
I don't know what Southern Girl sounds like. I mean, that's more of a Southern Belle, isn't it? Kind of thing, I think. I don't know what Americans sound like. Yeah.
Merphy, are you offended?
I'm not from the South, so not really, but also it wasn't good.
I've always been telling my master of accents. It's like I'm there, you know.
Maybe you should be a narrator.
Absolutely. Everyone, I love the idea of everyone would read a book, listen to my audiobook, and be like, "What is he doing?"
I say.
That's my Savine Glokta. That's
You're lined up to narrate Kings of the Flower Moon.
yeah. I'm gonna do that.
You're just gonna do that the whole thing.
I say, it's Savine. Dang Glokta.
There is. I'm not gonna mention it, but
I don't think she would have the same intimidating charm about her with that.
yeah. I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna get a bit of it and read it out at some point.
Send it in Boxer, please. Do a fully acted.
Yeah. Is that all of the? That's all the POVs, isn't it? Is there any returning character? Oh, Jazelle.
Yeah.
Jazelle.
I have thoughts on Jazelle.
Do we think? Yeah, go on then.
I was just saying, I think it's interesting because this sort of winds all the way back to what Gris was saying about how we see those, well, and Merphy as well, seeing those characters from the previous generation in the background doing stuff. And I think Jazelle really, he doesn't stand out. He sort of does the opposite.
Yeah.
In that you're like, in a typical fantasy, sort of established fantasy, you'd end one generation with, oh, this guy's the king. Oh, and then there's the like slightly embittered like vizier character with the illegitimate child. And seeing that sort of flipped on its head where Jazelle is miserable and his son's an idiot. Whereas Glokta and Ardy's child is like this incredibly wealthy, like well-respected, feared figure. And also it's just there like, my dad hates his life.
Jazelle is very pitiful as well. Like how often in scenes you're like from Savine's perspective where she's like ruling everything, and then it's like it's honestly just like, and the king was kind of bumbling around and he was waving his hands and drinking
like
wine.
Raises his hand in a closed council meeting and they're all like, shut up.
Yeah, it's like you're meant to be seen and not heard. Keep it down.
It's also,
do we think Baez killed Jazelle?
Yes.
Yes.
I do.
Which is really messed up.
I guess I just assumed that, but yeah.
Yeah, like because it's very messed up because Baez is essentially like, well, that's it. I'm going to stay in now. Kind
I
of.
thought he was done dirty. That's
thing.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was like, I need a new person to control.
And then it's almost like he gets distracted and he's like, I can't be bothered. And it's like, what was the point of killing Jazelle then? There was no need. He was more than happy. It was like he was just bored of not having, like you said, Grace, he was just bored of having someone not to push around. And he came back and he was like, if I'm on a vacation here, I need my entertainment. And
I need to bully someone and not someone who is downtrodden already. I need someone who is going to push back so that I can ruin their spirit.
It's like having a broken doll. It's like, well, the lights are broken in the eyes of this one. I can't see him anymore. Get him out. It's like he's throwing away like an old family toy. So sad.
I remember I was frustrated with, I thought he was done dirty, but at the same time, I was like, man, this was such an Abercrombie thing to do. And I'm like, to just kind of be like, yeah, you remember him. Well, guess what? Who cares? We're moving on.
Almost like a continuation of Jazelle's arc from the first law, where, especially in the second book, where he comes back and he's like, I'm a better man now. Like, I've gone on this journey to the end of the earth. I love Ardy. I'm going to come back. I'm going to marry her. I'm a better person now. And it just all collapses. And seeing that it never got better. And he's just there. He's miserable. He's married to a woman who hates him. His children are, or at least one of his children is a slight disappointment. I think it's interesting that we see so little of his other children. Like, we get that sense of like they're just distant.
Yeah. All the way through, because also doesn't really seem too much.
Well, I think it's because there's no real sort of like affection between Jazelle and the Queen, that it kind of makes sense that the children would just go off and do their own thing and live their own lives separately, leaving Orso behind.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Really sad, because Jazelle was my favorite character from the first four.
I know, that's where I was like, he was done dirty, because I just felt like, oh, this is after all that we got in the first law, then to just kind of be like, meh.
This is why I made the right decision. If you choose the worst character as your favorite character, you're going to have a great reading experience. Him choosing Leo Dan Brock is one of the biggest brain moves I've ever seen.
I don't know. I don't think I would have had a good time if Leo was my favorite character.
But if you genuinely believed Leo's your favorite, then you would, because you'd be like, this guy deserves everything he gets.
Exactly.
Wonderful.
Your Honor,
how did he lose his leg? He didn't deserve that.
Exactly.
So we have to ally with him. It's not just that they're our favorite. We actually have to ally with them and believe them.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I condemn every bad thing that he did, but I did enjoy him doing those things. Like, Your Honor, I plead guilty that my client is a hot mess. That's basically Leo in a nutshell. He's so wrong about everything, and I just kind of love seeing him be wrong about things. Like,
see, you can like him ironically. I like that.
It's not even ironic. I think I see a lot of myself in him in the worst ways. You know, the guy's easily led. He just wants to be given instructions. He's like, just tell me what I should think. He's very much, weirdly, this is such a tangent. He very much reminds me of Phoebe Waller-Bridge's character in Fleabag, where there's a scene in that show, for those who haven't seen it, where she goes to a therapist and just says, I want to be told what to do every second of every day and just switch off and not have to think about any of it. And I think that is Leo when he's not fighting people. He's like, I don't care about any of this. Just tell me. Like, he has all these essentially like substitute mothers. Like, first it's Finri, his actual mother. Then it's Savine, then it's Isha, and then when it's finally him, everything goes
evil. Surprise!
So wrong that all of those people, especially, well, Finri just sort of dips out and she's like, there's no helping him at this point. But I like that Savine and Isha basically gang up on him and are like, we've tried to steer you before, and now you're steering yourself. Everything's going terribly wrong, so we have to join forces to curtail whatever catastrophe you're causing.
Which I thought was interesting, where Savine, I mean, just speaking of kind of that whole catastrophe, like where Leo's kind of committed himself to that line, and she's just kind of like, well, analyzing the pros and cons of things, I guess I have to commit to. I just thought that was really clever. I was like, wow.
Yeah, no, Bryce, you're right, because that goes to show what he's like even more, because Savine has always been like like she will see things through, and then when she's like, well, we really actually have to do this, he's like, holy, like, you made all these plans, and she was like, you didn't, like, like, you were just gonna do it and like flail through it.
Yeah,
like,
I thought if we asked politely and pulled swords out, everything else would kind of fall into place for us. I didn't really. Man, Leo's such a man.
He's so beautifully naive as a character, which just makes it. There's something like earnest in the worst way about him, in that he genuinely believes the world does just work if everyone at all times is like, oh, I'll just do this and see how it works out. I feel like he just doesn't understand that things around him happen because people plan meticulously and have like ulterior motives, and he's just there like, well, I just took it all at face value and guess
and
I'll,
what Grace was saying, like that was the first time he like realizes that that's the thing that people do, almost like, oh,
Well, I think it's
what?
very, I think it's very reminiscent of Jazelle in the beginning of First Law. And it's that weird thing of what if Jazelle hadn't had a character arc that made him a better person, but in fact just the worst person. And seeing that sort of undoing of an arc that I loved from the First Law, I still kind of love it as an arc in The Age of Madness, just seeing like almost like a what if for that character, because there's so many similarities between the two of them, that seeing that character being undone was just really enjoyable to me.
Yeah.
Well, shall we have like closing remarks?
Good books.
Yeah, I feel like there's not much more to say than they're bangers. Some of the best fantasy written.
Top tier.
Top
Truly.
tier.
Top tier.
All-time
That's
favorite.
why we keep coming back. Why we keep coming back to Abercrombie. Just
where does it rank out of the one series you've read?
It ranks quite high. I mean, it's definitely up there at the top of some of the greatest books that I've ever read, and I've read one of the Horus Heresy books.
It's somehow your best and worst series simultaneously.
I love how you started the stream by saying he doesn't read, and then you ended the stream by saying, "This is the only book you've read, huh?"
It is factual. It's not exactly.
Well, I think it's almost like Flowers for Algernon in that reading this as the book, it's so hard to pick up another fantasy series and be like, well, it's not quite Abercrombie.
Would you like us to peer pressure you into Lions of Al-Rasan?
Yeah.
I thought we were going to go watch Lamora. I was ready to go.
Well, I think the trouble is, as obviously like an audio reader, Stephen Pacey's like the GOAT. He's just so good.
That was a bad starting place, frankly.
So much cut above the rest that I now, I'm looking for new series on Audible, and I'm like, oh, I don't really like the narrator for this one. I wish it was all read by Stephen Pacey.
Maybe you could send him a message and be like, "This is the book."
I am your biggest fan.
Would you mind like doing that for me?
Abercrombie's okay.
Personally, read all of these books for me, and then maybe I'll read them.
Well, it's hard, like the Malazan series, where the first 3 books are read by Ralph Lister, and then the rest are Michael Page, and you're like, you get like committed to this, and anyway, so yeah, you gotta. It's the narrator can make
his name.
What?
Michael Page is amazing. Don't slander his name.
Oh no! I love him. He's insanely good. Yeah. Especially because he does the Loch Lamora ones.
I think
we have like 2 minutes before we wrap up to talk about Rikke's visions and how. I just want to know if you guys thought, were her visions actually prophetic, or did all of them just happen because she made them happen? Because all the ones that come true seem to just be her making the choice herself, and the ones that don't come true seem wildly like inaccurate or like ambiguous, because there are some where she has a vision and it just turns out not to be right.
I'm kind of on the side of like their possibilities. So like I guess the answer would be she could make them happen, because I feel like she's seeing possible futures. But
yeah, I agree with you. I think it's almost like the equivalent of like gut instinct. Like she's essentially having a visualization of what her gut tells her is going to happen or could happen, and then she makes a decision based on that. I don't think it's quite like, because like the final vision, she has a choice of either I do nothing and that could happen, or I actually choose to act on it. So it's very like, it's not that, oh, this is inevitable. It's like, oh, my actions now are going to change this. So I think it's more gut instinct than actual prophetic.
This might be too wide of a perspective, but I don't know if the series can be considered fantasy without it being true to some degree. It's like the only magic in it almost.
That's true, to be fair.
Well, the eaters.
Yeah.
Right. the like one page of the eaters being mentioned. Like, I don't know, 4.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, it's very low, like magic fantasy.
So low. I
Yes.
kept being like, where? Like, I am so loving every part of this, but it's all just like political intrigue, scheming, like, which is also what I love. But I was just like, there's almost zero fantasy here.
It's essentially just life in Britain at the moment, like just put on page. It's kind of crazy. Like I was reading it, I was like, I feel like I'm at home. It's amazing.
And on that note, on that very cheery note, I guess Bryce, you have to go, so we will.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
We will say goodbye. Thank you so much, everybody, for getting back together for this. And I'm looking forward to more of our other chats when we read more books together. But I'm really glad we got to talk about these because they are so, so fantastic. And there's so much to say. So, yeah.
So much fun.
Thank you for joining me. Okay.
Thank you for inviting me as well.